Working on a project about Quebec province is akin to living on a seismic fault. It's very dynamic. Everything seems to be constantly in motion. When I sent in my proposal for this talk, it was my intention to link the topic to an event that happened a year ago at this time, when the Parti Québécois, the Separatist Party, was brought into power during provincial elections. They were able to form a minority government. They didn't have a majority. And at a downtown Montreal nightclub, Pauline Marois, the new Premiere of Quebec, was in the middle of her victory speech, and there was an attempt on her life. Two backstage technicians were shot. One was fatally wounded. And I was going to talk about that, but as I said, when you're dealing with Quebec, events have a way of overtaking you. So events have overtaken me. So I'm going to alter not my topic, but the point of reference a little bit. On September 10th of this year, just a few weeks ago, the government of Quebec, led by the separatist Parti Québécois, announced a proposal for a charter of Quebec values, which would, among other provisions, ban the wearing of conspicuous religious signs by the province's public employees. Given that hospitals, community clinics, and universities in Quebec are publicly administered, as are a great many primary and secondary schools, colleges of general and professional education, what we call cégep, and government-financed pre-kindergarten programs, a religiously observant doctor, nurse, orderly, teacher, or other civil servant, for instance, would not be permitted to show up for work, for example, in a hijab or a kippah. Rhetoric surrounding the Charter of Quebec values has been openly contentious and emotionally charged. To members of Quebec's cultural communities, the proposal seems aimed at curtailing participation in the public sector by Muslims, Jews, Hindus, and other religious groups, all in the name of building a totally secular society. If the charter were to become law, because it's not law yet, we're coming into an election probably in early December, and so if the Parti Québécois is successful in gaining a majority of the National Assembly, they will probably put this first on their agenda. If it were to become law, its provisions would stand in blatant defiance of federal constitutional protections guaranteed in Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Because this has been such an emotional issue, I think that as adherents to principles of general semantics, I think that this is a good opportunity to step back, think, and reflect, and look at what's going on here. So if we look below the surface of this proposal, there appears to be a deep historical undercurrent propelling the province in the direction of so-called secularization. 21st century Quebec constitutes a quasi-autonomous nation state possessing its own political institutions ruled by a French-speaking majority. As such, Quebec has for the last 5 decades managed to fence itself off from English-speaking Canada and North America. This isolation traditionally has fit well into expressions of nationalist sentiment in Quebec, shaped by the belief that Quebec is an island of French afloat in a North American sea of English. Quebec's distinctiveness has therefore set the stage for a political and social culture that excludes much of English Canada from the internal life of Quebec's population. The apparently irreconcilable chasm that exists between French and English speakers in Quebec and Canada often is referred to as two solitudes, a coinage attributed to Canadian author Hugh MacLennan's novel of the same name. Quebec's exclusivity, in turn, reinforces the widely held notion within the province of Francophone solidarity, perpetuating allegiance to a common national destiny among the French-speaking people of Quebec. That such sentiment has bred continued call for Quebec's sovereignty then should come as no great surprise. In order to better understand what this common destiny means in terms of day-to-day life in Quebec in the 21st century, we first must step backward in time to Great Britain's conquest of North America over the French in 1759 to 1760. Emerging from that key moment in Canadian history is an ideological construct that has insinuated itself into the social fabric of life in Quebec and impressed itself indelibly upon public discourse in the province. In 1760, La Nouvelle-France went from being a colony of France to a colony of the British Crown. By that time, the French-speaking colonists of New France had firmly established their identities as Canadiens, as distinct from their European ancestors as the American colonists were from the British. Among measures the British introduced into French Canada were the imposition of English common law and restrictions curtailing the participation of Catholics in public positions. In 1774, after considerable petitioning of the Crown by the French colonists, Britain reintroduced French civil law and removed impediments to Catholics holding government posts. Then, almost 20 years later, the British, in an apartheid-like act, divided its Canadian outpost into a Western, English-speaking partition, Upper Canada, ruled by common law, and an Eastern, French-speaking partition, Lower Canada, which retained French civil law. Thus separated, the people of Lower Canada, future Quebec, were free to follow their own path, limited as it may have been, which meant unwavering adherence to the French language and Catholic doctrine. This freedom did not come with sovereignty, however. So constrained, the French people of Lower Canada looked inward, the Church guiding them in the hope of ensuring the province's collective survival. This introspection drew the Canadiens toward the margins of established economic order of the English. According to Michael Beheels, Quebec clerical intelligentsia rationalized the economic superiority of the Anglophone minority by elaborating a nationalist ideology which emphasized a non-economic objective, thereby concealing the true source of economic inferiority, Anglophone domination of the Francophone majority of Quebec. The population was mobilized by the Church around local symbols, anchored in devout belief in religion, attention to the land, and shunning all things modern. Leading the retreat from the secular world, the Catholic clergy earnestly believed they could encourage Francophone self-sufficiency while shielding the English-speaking elite from any competitive threat the French population might pose. This arrangement remained the status quo until 1960, when Quebec's Quiet Revolution upended 2 centuries of oppression and ultimately lent legitimacy to the idea of a sovereign Quebec. Also, if I might add, part of this upending of this 200 years of oppression was the total disenfranchisement of the Roman Catholic Church in Quebec. In the years after the Second World War and the lead up to the Quiet Revolution, Quebec society underwent such deep, pervasive, and wrenching socioeconomic changes that for the first time since the Conquest, the fragile thread of continuity with the living past was threatened with complete destruction. For 200 years, Anglophones existed as the environment in which Francophones lived. The Quiet Revolution signaled a social shift where the old environmental arrangements between the English and French would no longer remain sustainable. Despite the emancipatory promise of the Quiet Revolution, by the 1960s, the people of Quebec still strongly defined themselves by their language, religion, and shared customs. Yet they still saw themselves as a conquered people. Even in the face of the empirical realities of the Quiet Revolution, today's Quebec Francophones view themselves as a community organized around an essential understanding of the account of events which have occurred since the Conquest. The Conquest emerges as a traumatic narrative of colonization and defeat, followed by a 200-year political and social compromise by the Canadiens with the English, something Maurice Charland calls a drama of subjugation, collective affirmation, and survival. For Quebec Francophones, the Quiet Revolution therefore meant the sudden acquisition of political and economic rights and access to the machinery of state. And largely for that reason, notes Richard Handler, the Quiet Revolution has acquired mythic status in Quebec, providing contemporary Quebec Francophones with a national identity, a shared self-description. Yet the Quiet Revolution acted as the beginning, not a culmination, of a process. For in the minds of many Quebec nationalists, the emancipation of the province only will attain completion once the people have achieved self-determination. Implicit in this quest is the establishment of conditions conducive to communal survival of the French-speaking populace, which means firmly setting Francophones apart from Anglophones, militating against any group construed as impeding progress towards self-determination, and combating political, social, and economic hegemony